Who's ready for part 11 in this series of videos where I answer questions submitted by all of you? Remember that if you've got a question that you'd like answered, you can leave it in the comment section down below and I'll get to it in a future video. But that's enough preamble, let's get right into it. Crossovenon asks, what did you think of Kyle Rayner's time as a member of the Titans, and the editorial mandate to make him and Donna Troy a thing? I think it's a shame that it isn't regarded as a bigger part of his history. Kyle's time with the Titans has been almost completely overshadowed by his membership in Grant Morrison's JLA, despite being an important step in his early superhero journey. This was the first super team Kyle ever joined, and it's where he met Donna Troy. Maybe it would have helped if there was more overlap between Titans and Green Lantern, because other than Donna, the rest of the team rarely ever appeared in Kyle's book. So unless you were reading the Titans series, it didn't feel like Kyle was really a part of that world. I definitely think that run of Titans is worth revisiting and reappraising today, since it's been overlooked for so long. As for Kyle and Donna getting together, regardless of how it happened, I think it was probably Kyle's best relationship after Alex. Maybe I'm remembering it better than it actually was, I haven't read those old issues in a long time, but I prefer to see Kyle meet someone new through his job instead of just dating other Lanterns. There's nothing wrong with Jade or Sora, I love those characters, but dating someone outside of the Lantern family makes Kyle's world feel bigger and more fleshed out. Beep Boop Games wants to know, if there was one person in the DC universe who would permanently get a Lantern ring, who would it be, and what core would the ring be? Scarecrow, 100%. It just makes too much sense for him to be a member of the Sinestro Corps. I've said it before, but I think Scarecrow and Jessica, forced to work together as sector partners protecting the Earth, could be a fantastic sci-fi horror buddy cop drama. Corey McGimney asks, if Supergirl were to join a Lantern Corps post-Woman of Tomorrow, with her being older and more emotionally mature, would she go back to being a Red Lantern or something that's more neutral? I was also thinking maybe Power Girl could join a Lantern Corps because she has her own emotional issues, and maybe it would give Power Girl something new to do that keeps her apart and distinct from Supergirl. First of all, Supergirl Woman of Tomorrow is an amazing book, and everyone should read it if they haven't already. Without spoiling anything, the way that story ends makes me think that Kara would still be a Red Lantern. She is older and more mature, but she's clearly vengeful, so I think she'd still qualify for a red ring. As for Power Girl, yeah, I think introducing some rings to heighten their emotions would be a fun way to play with the awkward conflict that comes from them being two versions of the same person. During the New 52, Power Girl had her life together while Supergirl felt like the inferior version of Power Girl. And from what little I've seen, the current status quo seems like it's flipped, with Power Girl anxiously trying to find her place in the world while things are going fine for Supergirl. I think they need to figure out a different way for these two to interact, because this sort of back and forth stops making sense after a while, especially considering everything that Power Girl has been through to build a new life for herself in a world that already had Supergirl. I've talked about it a little bit before, but I think it would make perfect sense for Power Girl to get an orange ring, since so much has been taken from her. First she lost her version of Krypton, then she lost her version of Earth when she fell into the main DC universe, where she lost the ability to fully be herself because Supergirl already exists here. And she wants it all back, which easily attracts an orange ring. Give a red ring to Supergirl and watch what would end up being the biggest and most emotionally cathartic battle these two characters could ever possibly have against each other. By the time it's all over and the rings are gone, I think their relationship would be different, because of how much personal baggage they worked through during the fight. I'd love to see these two reach a point where they think of each other as sisters, instead of one of them always assuming that their existence is invalidated by the other. Cat Lawyer Will Defend for Treats says, I find it interesting that Alan Scott was originally Defender of the Green, aka the planet. Do you think an argument can be made that he was actually protecting the White Lantern's life entity that is inside the Earth? Maybe Grundy's power came from the Black Lantern in some way. That's an interesting idea, and I think it would actually work better for the New 52 Earth 2 version, where it really leans into the idea of Green Lantern being a defender of nature and Grundy being an agent of rot and decay. The whole Starheart thing makes it harder for the main universe Alan and Grundy to fit with this idea, although I think it would be a pretty easy retcon to say that forces like the green and the red exist as a defensive layer to protect the life entity, making the various swamp things and anyone with animal-based powers into guardians with higher purpose. Random Aussie asks, do you have a favorite or least favorite suit for each of the main Earth Lanterns? Personally, I'm a big fan of their Injustice comic designs. I actually really love Guy Gardner's costume, especially the modern version where the boots aren't ultra bulky. The costume that sticks out in my mind as being my least favorite is what he wore in the Elseworlds miniseries, JLA Destiny. They were trying to go minimalistic but took it too far, and it just looks like a placeholder that they never got around to finishing. Also, this isn't a Green Lantern costume, but I've always hated his warrior design. Nothing about it appeals to me. For Hal, it may be an unpopular opinion, but I think his best look is the Parallax costume. My least favorite is him as the Spectre. They just recolored his classic Green Lantern costume and then gave him the cloak and skin tone of the classic Spectre, and I don't think these elements combine well at all. John's modern JLU-inspired costume is both my favorite John Stewart costume and, in my opinion, one of the best Green Lantern costumes, period. It's simple, it's iconic, and I can't think of a single thing I'd change about it. The one I like the least is the costume he wore back in the early 90s. I don't know what they were thinking with this design. The top part of the Green Lantern symbol fans out to cover the shoulders, but then the bottom of the symbol extends all the way down in a straight line connecting to some green trunks, and the whole thing looks so unbalanced and awkward. My favorite Kyle Rayner costume is absolutely his original, with his unique symbol. They replaced it with the Green Lantern Corps symbol for a while, and I hate that. Most superhero costumes from the 1990s are over-designed nightmares, but this one is simple enough to feel timeless while being unique enough to stand out. But his worst costume is this thing. It came as the result of this really cool scene in the first arc of Green Lantern New Guardians, where one of every ring flew onto Kyle's fingers at the same time. And it was his first time trying to control all of the lights in the emotional spectrum together. But the moment was kind of ruined by this costume that you can tell they just sort of threw together in a hurry. The color makes it look boring, the unique design elements seem like they're randomly tacked on, and they just sort of stuck all 7 symbols on the front of the costume in seemingly random places. It looks like a half-hearted afterthought, which it probably was, and it's hideous. Jessica's only ever had 2 costumes and 1 color variant, so I guess my favorite is her Green Lantern costume and my least favorite is her Power Ring costume. Simon got a new costume at the very end of the Jeffrey Thorne run of Green Lantern, but it was only around for like 2 panels, and the design was a little busy. I do think it's time for Simon to get a new look, but I don't think this is it. For Alan Scott, you simply cannot top the original. It looks silly and there's more red and purple than there is green, but that doesn't change the fact that any alteration they ever made to this design feels like a downgrade. Alan's worst costume is absolutely the one I put on your screen right now, which he wore for a few issues back in 2011, and my god, does it look terrible. Believe it or not, the character I'm having the most trouble with is Jade. She's had so many different costumes and all of them are just sort of okay. I like her current costume, but it's kind of just the classic Green Lantern Corps costume in a different color. I kinda like the costume she was wearing during Final Night, but the belt and pouches aren't great, and the symbol would look better if it was in the center and didn't connect down to the boot. Her original might just be her best look. My least favorite is a tie between the one she wore when she led the Outsiders, with the weird block of white that starts halfway down her chest and ends halfway down her legs, and those random black circles on her shoulders. And the costume she wore during Judd Winnick's run, where they just took Kyle's costume, enlarged the symbol, and moved it to the center, which looks kinda awkward. But then for some reason, they gave her these ugly blue gloves that don't go with anything. Masked Moth asks, if you had to do an amalgamation of the Lanterns and the Power Rangers, how would you do it? Alright, I'm going to use Mighty Morphin as the basis since that's why I know the best. Krona is attempting an updated version of his old experiment. Instead of observing the birth of the universe, this time he wants to see the creation of the multiverse. So of course it goes horrifically wrong and blows a big hole from the DC universe into the Power Rangers universe. If that wasn't bad enough, the explosion caused the emotional spectrum and the morphin grid to become tangled. The Guardians send all the Earth Green Lanterns through the hole to fix this somehow. The effects of Krona's experiment has hit the Power Rangers hard. Every time the Rangers morph, they mainline emotional spectrum energy that corresponds to the color of their usual power, so the Red Ranger will be overwhelmed with rage energy like a Red Lantern. In order to untangle the emotional spectrum from the morphin grid, Zordon and Alpha use the Lantern's rings as the basis for new spectrum morphers. With these, the Lanterns can morph like Power Rangers, drawing all of the grid energy away from the Rangers. So we've got Lanterns with Power Ranger powers, Power Rangers with Lantern powers, everybody's freaking out, nobody knows how their powers work, and that's when Rita Repulsa sends in a couple gigantic monsters to trample everyone. Kyle, Jessica, and Joe demand to be the ones to get to drive the Megazord, and they have the time of their lives doing it. The rest of the Lanterns stay on the ground and try their best to get the Rangers to calm down. Eventually, they're able to teach Billy the Blue Ranger how to unleash enough hope energy to severely weaken the emotions overwhelming his team. Except for the Green Ranger, whose spectrum energy only gets stronger, but it's nothing that the combined wills of all the Green Lanterns can't handle. At the end of the day, everyone gets their correct powers back, and everything goes back to normal. Billy wishes he had time to study the rings. Jessica took like 100 selfies with Alpha, and most of them are out of focus. Hal regrets not getting to fly the pterodactyl Zord. Then the Lanterns are teleported back to their own universe, and the Guardians seal the breach behind them. Dead Sprite asks, from an in-universe perspective, how much control do you think Hal had over himself during his time as Parallax? Because modern writers tend to make it seem like he had none at all, which I can't personally see because he always felt more like an extremely misguided hero rather than an outright villain. Yeah, this is something that no writer at DC has ever even tried to explain. Because you're right, when Hal became Parallax back in the 90s, he was still regular Hal Jordan, still refusing to stop doing what he believes is right. The biggest difference is that what he believed was right no longer matched what everyone else believed was right. He definitely took things way too far, but Parallax was less of a villain turn and more of an example of how a change in perspective can be dangerous when a single person has too much power. This is the kind of character-driven moral ambiguity that the Jeff Johns emotional entity retcon can't really account for. If Parallax was always a giant space monster made of pure fear, why would it help Hal reboot the universe? Why would it care about bringing Green Arrow back to life or restoring Jon Stewart's ability to walk? Why would it sacrifice itself to reignite the sun? It doesn't make sense, so writers just leave it alone. But I will tell you my personal headcanon. So we first learned about the Parallax retcon back in 2005 in the pages of Green Lantern Rebirth number 3, which stated that during Emerald Twilight, Hal wasn't being directly controlled by Parallax. Rather, that Parallax introduced fear into Hal's mind, which made Hal act out of character and do things that he wouldn't normally do. He wanted to resurrect Coast City, the Guardians and the Green Lantern Corps said he couldn't do that, and he was terrified of the possibility that he couldn't undo that tragedy. So he lashed out, fought back, and everything came crashing down. My theory is that Hal remained in this state after Parallax possessed him. The Parallax entity has spent billions of years drowning in the willpower of the Green Lantern Central Battery. The issue describes it as being, quote, comatose and basically dead for all of that time. So I personally can't imagine that the Parallax entity was in good shape when it finally got out. It was likely in an extremely weakened state, and it may not even have been fully conscious. So it hid inside of Hal, unable to take control of him. But even so, the presence of all that fear within him was enough to keep Hal going down the path he started in Emerald Twilight. All of his decisions were still his own, but he made them because of how the Parallax entity influenced his worldview by introducing a level of fear into Hal's mind that he wasn't used to naturally experiencing. Maybe that's too much of a reach, I don't know. I just really don't want the Parallax entity to be an excuse for everything Hal did between Emerald Twilight and Green Lantern Rebirth. Whether you like that phase of Hal's life or not, the fact remains that erasing all of his personal responsibility for it makes those events pointless. Whereas keeping them his responsibility adds a lot to his character because those actions are something he'll have to live with and reckon with for the rest of his life. Aranya asks, do you think that an Elseworlds in the vein of Superman's secret identity could work for Green Lantern? This is a really good idea. Superman's Secret Identity is a story taking place in a world that's more or less our real world, where everything is mundane, superpowers don't exist, and superheroes are fictional characters in comic books. The main character is named Clark Kent, but he's just a random guy. His family has the last name Kent, and his parents thought it would be fun to name their son after Superman. Then one day, he wakes up and inexplicably has all of Superman's powers. And the story is about what someone in that situation, in a specifically non-super world, might do to try and live out his heroic fantasies without losing his normal life in the process. I think that formula would map perfectly onto Green Lantern. I personally know Green Lantern fans who have named their children after Green Lantern characters, so the idea that there could be someone out there named Hal Jordan because his dad loves comic books is absolutely believable. And what drives the story can be the fact that this guy isn't anything at all like the character he was named after, and he's likely even grown to resent the character for being everything he isn't. So what happens when a real, functional Green Lantern ring, something that cannot possibly exist in this universe, lands right in front of him? What would he do with it? Does it work exactly like in the comics? How much will he have to change to make the ring work for him, and would that mean abandoning the person he'd always been? You could tell a really interesting story about the inspirational nature of superheroes, and how that coexists with the impossible standard they represent. Wario Scapelli asks, suppose the universe finally gets sick of the Malthusians' leadership and kicks them all out of the Corps. Which members of the Green Lantern Corps would you like to see take their place as the new Guardians of the Universe? I think the most logical choice would be to have a council of veteran Green Lanterns guiding the Corps. The problem is that I don't think very many of them would actually want to give up their normal duties to take an administrative role, so maybe the Council of Veterans should have a rotating membership, with a couple of permanent members who can keep things stable in the long term. Salek makes the most sense as a permanent part of all this, along with Mogo and maybe Stell. Those three would ensure that a foundation of logical reason is always present in whatever the Corps does, and it would balance out a lot of the more impulsive tendencies of the other council members. Zeta Omega says, hey, after we found out how Joe Maline's ring runs off of slightly different willpower than the main rings, and how that focus resulted in slightly different mechanics for the ring, do you have any ideas for other willpower variants, or variants of the other emotions in the spectrum, and how might they make their rings different? The Corps uses the willpower to overcome fear. Joe uses the will to endure a long struggle with no end in sight. So maybe we could do something with the will to change. The will to break old habits, step outside of your comfort zone, and consider new perspectives and possibilities. It's the exact opposite of the stubbornness of most Green Lanterns, and your power would be tied to your own continual self-exploration and self-improvement. A ring fueled by this kind of willpower would have some kind of transmutation ability, turning your willingness to enact change into a literal power. Tevya Smoka asks, if DC and Marvel ever did a crossover again, which Marvel characters would you like to see meet a Green Lantern? Because for me, I'd love to see Jade team up with Mayday Parker, Spider-Girl. I'd love to see Hal Jordan team up with Carol Danvers, since they're both cosmic heroes who'd used to fly for the United States Air Force. They probably annoy the hell out of each other at first, but as soon as one of them lets slip that they used to fly planes, they'd never stop talking about it. Whatever threat they had to deal with would end with them sitting at a 24-hour diner swapping stories until the sun comes up. King of the Abyss wants to know, Do you think the Lantern Corps could split into smaller ideological factions around the nature of how they interpret their emotional power? Hell yeah! You can't put this many super stubborn people in a room together and expect them all to agree on what's the right way to do this job. Some lanterns are more analytical and want to approach every situation with a very calculated response. Other lanterns think the best move is to immediately rush in and solve the problem with force. Some lanterns think the Corps is a military unit, while others view it as law enforcement. And then there are those lanterns who don't think the Corps should even be using their rings, because it'll drain the emotional reservoir and doom the universe. A concept that nobody wants to remember, but it should definitely count since everything in DC history is currently canon. The whole thing with the reservoir is simultaneously a terrible idea and a super interesting one. It's hard to root for the good guys and enjoy their cool powers when using those powers is slowly killing the universe. But at the same time, the ideological split it caused in the Green Lantern Corps has a lot of potential to flesh out characters by forcing them to debate an issue that has no clear-cut right answer. Because if the Corps stops using the emotional spectrum, the reservoir will be fine and the universe will survive. But then all the good that would have been done by the Lanterns won't happen, and countless people will suffer as a direct result. Cindering Coyote wants to know, what Lantern Corps would Ruby characters be? More specifically, Cinder, Raven, and Salem. Cinder would probably be an Orange Lantern. She believes that she's entitled to everything that she wants. She's got a superiority complex and cannot tolerate anything that makes her feel weaker than someone else, thus her bottomless appetite for power. Raven would be a Yellow Lantern for a couple reasons. She has a clinical and cutthroat view of strength and survival, and she very rightly intimidates everyone around her. But all of that is an act she puts on out of self-preservation, since she is terrified of Salem, and can't think of a better way to stay alive in a world with that kind of monster. I think Salem might dual-wield orange and red. She is so resentful of anyone who stands in the way of her getting what she wants. She's also willing to do absolutely anything to get her way. Little things like ending an entire era of humanity, or going to war against the gods, and even destroying the entire planet so that maybe her own pain and suffering would finally end. And since we're talking about Ruby, I just wanted to take a moment to say that my opinion on that show has changed a lot. I've mentioned before that Ruby is something of a guilty pleasure that I keep watching despite how bad it is. But the fact is that after finishing season 9, I realized that the writing, acting, and animation have all improved tremendously. And even though the fight scenes still aren't on the same level as they were when Monty was with us, the fights in the show have finally reached a level where they're exhilarating and fun again. So yeah, Ruby isn't a bad show that I watch as a guilty pleasure. Not anymore. Now it's just a good show that I like. Unfortunately, I can't say the same about the crossover movies with the Justice League. I haven't had the chance to watch the second one yet, but the first one wasn't very good, and isn't even remotely close to the level of quality we get from the most recent season of the show. There is one thing to love about it, though: the movie's version of Jessica Cruz. I'm not a fan of the redesign. It's way too busy, and I actually mistook her for Hal in the promo material, but all of that stuff is superficial compared to how the character is actually used in the story, and I'm happy to say that they knocked it out of the park. What being a Green Lantern means to Jessica, and how that relates to her struggle with anxiety, is both a key plot point and the emotional core of the first movie. Also, her voice actor, Jeannie Tirado, delivers my favorite reading of the Green Lantern Oath that I've ever heard in an animated movie or show. And from what I've seen, a large portion of the Ruby fanbase now wants to adopt Jessica as a permanent part of the Ruby universe. There are a ton of people out there who now love a Green Lantern because of this movie, and I think that makes the whole movie worth it. And finally, Codename Coles asks, what are your thoughts on the alien designs in Green Lantern comics? My favorite designs are the ones that look truly alien, and I wish we'd see them have more prominent roles over humanoid-looking aliens. Yeah, there are a lot of Star Trek-style aliens in Green Lantern, where they're basically human except for one or two physical features or their skin is an unusual color. I think that when it comes to alien designs, there's plenty of room for a little bit of everything. Sentient math equations, guys with a volcano for a head, Salic. And then if you want a few who are just humans with one quirky detail, that's fine. They just should never be the majority. Especially not when we've got characters like Rotlop Fan, Mogo, and Box reminding us what can happen when creators get a little silly and let their imaginations run wild. After all, they're pulling characters from all over the entire universe. Anything is possible, so there's no good reason to play it safe with character designs. And that'll do it for this batch. If you have a question you'd like answered, leave it in the comments section down below and I will get to it in a future video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already so that you'll know when the next installment of this Q&A series comes out. Until then, thank you for taking the time to watch. My name is Dan. We'll talk again soon.